and I'm the editor, creator, and producer of what you're watching right now, Blade Talk. If you are new here, welcome, and you find this presentation helpful, informative, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Do me an even greater favor and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate all the support that I am given. In this presentation, I want to cover the emails that I've received, the comments that I've seen on this idea that orthodoxy is the only authentic way to do Jewish. I see a lot of Reform Jews, maybe even conservative Jews, that have felt a certain way about their Jewish status in the Jewish community. And I want to present it in the following way, just so we can get an appreciation of going all the way back and explaining through Jewish history so that you get a better understanding that Judaism has never been a monolith. If you're interested, let's hit that intro and let's begin. Okay, so first I want to start from the premise that I mentioned before. Judaism has never been a monolith. And I want to explain that through going through Jewish history. So I just did an intro to Torah, expanding and explaining the 5 books of Moses. Afterwards, Joshua leads us into the Promised Land. Everyone is settled in their own specific territory of the land. We have judges, some prophets that rule over certain matters, but for the most part, everyone is in their own specific area they keep to themselves. As the Jews start to look around at other nations, they see that other nations have established a monarchy. They've elected kings, queens, etc. So the Jews say, well, we want a king. We want a centralized government. To which God responds, you don't need a king. God will be your king. But the Jews insist, we want a king. So God tells Samuel to anoint them a king. At which point, it's King Saul. King Saul is chosen. Now he's reluctant to take the position, and the Jews aren't crazy about him either. But because he is victorious against the Jewish people's enemies, he gets the job. But King Saul does something horrible and disobeys God, tries to bring a sacrifice on his own, in which he was told that the prophet Samuel should bring the sacrifice, but King Saul didn't listen. So at that moment, the leadership was stripped from King Saul and given to King David. Now, King David was an amazing king, but he wasn't perfect either. And there's this misconception that King David committed adultery, when in fact that's actually not true. King David made all of his soldiers sign a get or divorce paperwork to their wives, just in case the soldier was lost at war. Because if a soldier was lost at war, it kind of cripples the woman because she can't move on, because she doesn't know whether her husband is alive or dead. That being said, what King David was guilty of was abuse of power. And he ends up unaliving one of his most loyal soldiers because he coveted that soldier's wife. So it wasn't adultery, it was abuse of power. And this sent a strong message to all Jews. It doesn't matter whether you're a king, a teacher, a husband, a parent. No one is above the Torah, and you shouldn't abuse your position. You shouldn't abuse your authority, abuse your power. So King David ultimately writes a book of Psalms, repenting for this sin. Then we have King David's son, King Solomon. Now, King Solomon was one of the wisest kings the Jewish people ever had. However, in his old age, he succumbed to lust. Again, King Solomon was very wise. As a matter of fact, the first temple was authorized to be built under King Solomon. But in his old age, again, he starts to backslide. The women are convincing him to perform idol worship, things of that nature. So King Solomon passes away, and King Solomon's son takes over. And there is dispute about economics on what the first temple cost. And the dispute becomes so enraged that it causes a split in the entire nation. The north secedes from the south. So in the north, you have the kingdom of Israel, and in the south, you have the kingdom of Judah. Now, again, the Jews wanted to centralize the government, be united under one ruler. That lasted all of 80 years. 80 years before a civil war broke out between the North and the South. Then you have the North, which was sent prophet after prophet trying to prevent them from idol worship and reminding them to get back to Torah, etc. But the North doesn't listen. So God punishes the North by allowing the Assyrians to conquer the North, in which 10 tribes were lost. Then in the South, you have prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, in which they try to discourage the South from making the same mistakes that the North did. Ultimately, the South doesn't listen, and Babylonia takes over the South, or the kingdom of Judah, in which case we're sent into exile. Now, while we're in exile, many of us try to stick to ourselves. There is the prophet Ezekiel that is sent, and Daniel, and they try to reassure the Jewish people that they're not forsaken. And over time, the Persians take over, and King Cyrus allows the Jewish people to go back home. And some do, and some do not. So at this time, you have Nehemiah and Ezra orchestrating the return to Israel and the rebuilding of the second temple. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and now when we return from exile, they try to rebuild the second temple, which they do. Now, There's a famous sociologist named Peter Berger, and his emphasis, one of his big talking points was that you can't unsee modernity. Basically, once you see change in the environment, you can't unsee it. So it causes people to do Jewish differently while we're in exile. Some, again, go back to the land, and some don't. But those that do, there arose many different sects of Judaism. You had the Pharisees, you had the Sadducees, and the Pharisees adapted to being in exile, not having a temple, etc. And the Sadducees were the Jewish elite, if you will. They wanted to reinstate the priesthood, get the temple up and running, and everything be centered around the temple. They wanted to go back to the way things used to be. But as I stated, once you see modernity and things change around you, you can't unsee it. So the Pharisees were like, no, we've adapted to not having a temple. We've adapted to praying and studying the Torah. We've adapted to the oral law, the oral tradition, and we're going to keep doing that. Now, within this time frame, Rome actually took over. The Roman Empire took over, and now you have other groups or sects of Jews that arise. Now you have, along with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you also have the Zealots, you also have the Nazarites, you also have the Essenes. Okay. Again, I go through all this to demonstrate that Judaism has never been a monolith. So stay with me. So you have all of these different groups of Jews believing different things. The Zealots were more militant against the Roman Empire. They wanted to take up arms, to gather a militia to fight their oppressors. The Essenes were kind of the hippies of the Jewish people. And they would go out in the middle of nowhere and pray and bury scrolls and things like that. Then you had the Nazarites, in which they favored a Mashiach or a Messiah because they were so oppressed. Again, the Zealots just wanted to fight their oppressor. The Nazarites wanted to depend on a leader to fight for them, basically hoping that the Jewish Messiah would come soon. And then, of course, you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, what's interesting is that between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they didn't play nice at all. And you had both the Sadducees and the Pharisees on the Sanhedrin. They didn't play well. Many would even conspire with the Romans, our oppressors at the time, to essentially jail the opposing Jewish faction. So they were constantly going at each other until Rome decided to take over the entire area completely. And with that, the temple was destroyed. And what happened to these sects? Well, the Nazarites married out and followed Jewish leaders and ultimately fell into Gentile nations, married non-Jews and whatnot. So they were gone. Then you had the Zealots. When you go against the Roman Empire and you lose, they didn't leave survivors. They like to make examples out of people. So there went the Zealots. The Essenes were living again on the outskirts. They were kind of the hippies of the Jewish people, but they didn't believe in having children. So if you don't have offspring, you're not going to be around for too much longer. So there went the Essenes. Now what's left is the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees, once Rome destroyed the temple, many Sadducees essentially centralized their belief and their religion around the temple. Once the Romans destroyed it, there went the Sadducees, which leaves the Pharisees. So without the Pharisees, you wouldn't have Judaism today. And it was their ability to adapt to exile, to adapt to not having a temple, which caused Judaism ultimately to survive. So we fast forward and we reach the era of the Hasidic Jews, Hasidim, in which before that, Jews, there was just being Jewish. You had different towns that had a Jewish community, and you had this all-powerful chief rabbi. And if you were Jewish and you lived in that town, you were supposed to listen to the guy. Okay? But shortly after, there arose the Hasidic movement. And what the Hasidic movement did was it opened up Judaism to everyone. See, before that, the rabbis had ultimate control of the Jews. These weren't just teachers. These were lawyers. These were political figures. These were doctors. These were people that held great authority. And then enter the Hasidic movement, and they wanted to open up the Torah, the Talmud to anyone. And at that time, the average person couldn't read or write. But in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, there arose a prominent leader, and they were big into the mystical side of Judaism, studying the Kabbalah. And they would be known to perform miracles. They will be known to know angels on a first name basis. They knew God's name. They had a very in tune relationship with the mystical elements of Judaism. And they basically stated that every Jew has a divine spark inside them. So everyone should be allowed to express their Judaism in their own way. Now, this infuriated the traditional Jews. Later, they branded themselves as the Misnagdim, which basically means opponents. They opposed the Hasidic Jews, the mystical elements of Judaism, because they stated that the average Jew couldn't read. they could barely make it through the first page in the Talmud, and that only scholars of the highest eminence should be teaching Jewish law, should be teaching what's in the Torah. And the Hasidic movement said no, it should be for everyone. Now, this wasn't a peaceful disagreement. Once again, they co-opted with local authorities to jail the opposition. They would burn each other's literature. They called each other heretics. They weren't really Jewish, etc. Now, this goes on until Europe became more democratic. Now, when this happened, Reform Judaism took hold. And these were liberal rabbis that felt that there should be a way to incorporate the modern world into their Jewish lifestyle. And I want to clear up a common misconception, and that is that Reform was an assimilationist movement. That's not true. People, once they seen that the doors were starting to open to Jews, because keep in mind at that time, anti-Semitism was very high. Jews couldn't own land. They couldn't live outside of the ghettos that they were in. They couldn't get certain jobs, etc., etc. Once that opened to Jews and there was more opportunity to Jews, many were leaving anyway. Jews were abandoning Judaism anyway. And what Reform did was basically say we have to find a way to incorporate the modern day of what we're seeing and our Jewish identity. There has to be a way to connect the two. So while the Misnagdim and the Hasidic movements were arguing over the mystical elements of Judaism, and again, you had the Misnagdim that stated that only the rabbis and the scholars should be teaching Torah, should be teaching what's in the Talmud, and the Hasidim, which basically said no, everyone, and I mean everyone, and women included, should be able to teach Torah, to teach the Talmud, etc. While they were arguing over that, and again, it wasn't a peaceful disagreement. They were expelling each other, calling each other, heretics, saying that the other side isn't really Jewish, etc. While they were doing that, the environment opened up to Jews to gain more opportunities. And so there were a sect that wanted to reform Judaism. So basically you have the Misnagdim and the Hasidim arguing over how sharp the blade should be to perform Shlita. And the Reform Jews were basically saying, okay, you all argue over that, and I'm going to go eat some shellfish tonight. I'm going to go have a bacon double cheeseburger tonight. And the Hasidim and the Misnagdim looked at the Reform Jews and said, whoa, wait a minute. So they decided to come together. Okay, let's put our differences aside because we have a greater threat here. And the Reform movement called this group that banded together Orthodox. So, again, the Reform movement noticed that while these two movements were arguing, people were leaving Judaism in droves. So, the Reform movement abandoned a lot of the traditions, ceremonial laws, and focused in on the ethical laws. And the Orthodox Jews rejected all of this. They said, no, you can't abandon the ceremonial, the ritual laws, etc. It's all baked in. And the Reform movement said, no, times are changing. We have to be able to adapt. That's exactly, if you recall, what the Pharisees did. They adapted to not having a temple. They adapted to being in exile. They adapted to living in ghettos. But now that things were starting to open up, again, once you see modernity, you can't unsee it. And I find it interesting that you have people, mainly in the Orthodox camp, that will say things like, well, no, you got to stick to your guns and stick to tradition and stick to the ceremonial laws, and it's all or nothing. And I always say that, I'm sure that it's very easy to say that in the free country that you live in. I'm sure that you're living in a country that allows you to practice your rituals and ceremonial laws. But if you actually can wrap your head around the fact that at the time that those Jews were living in, the environment that they lived in, they couldn't get good paying jobs to feed their families. Their children couldn't go to certain schools. They couldn't own land, etc. I truly believe you'd be looking at things from a very different perspective. So it's easy now for you to say, in the comfort of the country that you're living in that allows you to practice your religion and read the Torah and build shuls, etc. So I like to point that out. Nevertheless, so you have the Reform movement that abandoned a lot of the traditions. Basically, they got rid of anything that made Judaism appear weird. They introduced organ music into service. They moved Shabbat to Sundays, actually. They wanted to show people, again, their environment, that we're just a religion, just like the Christians and whatnot. And they did this to appease the population around them. They didn't want to be segregated against. They didn't want to ruffle any feathers. They wanted to live peacefully among everyone else. And it was like that up until World War II, in which Adolf Hitler didn't care whether you were Orthodox, Reform, secular, didn't matter. And at that time, I think that the Reform movement underwent a change. And that change was, well, we tried to get rid of a bunch of things that, was considered maybe strange to try to fit in. That didn't work. I always say that I believe God reminded us of who we are. There is no escaping it. So afterward, the Reform movement actually went back to observing Shabbat on the correct day. They instituted many of the traditions back. Now, what the Reform movement did was it basically encouraged Jews to keep the ethical laws. And what you do outside of that is up to you. They put the ownership of fulfilling mitzvot in your hands. Now, of course, the Orthodox rabbis, the ones that held authority and whatnot, they didn't like that so much. They didn't like that idea. And one thing you should know about elders with power, it's not so much whether or not something gets done. It's how it gets done. They want to control that aspect as well. So, the Reform movement basically said follow the ethical laws, and whether you choose to keep kosher or not, that's completely up to you. How you want to observe Shabbat, that's basically up to you. And they really put the authority, you're pretty much over your own Judaism. And to me, there's beauty in that, because it gives you the power to determine how much you want to observe, as opposed to someone forcing you. Again, I stated that the Torah says to the Jewish people, you are to be a holy nation just as God is holy. But understand what that means. You are to separate yourself. Change the word holy out. You are to separate yourself just as God is separate from this material world. Now it's up to you how separate you want to be in order to gain a closer connection with God. Again, at the very base, keep the ethical laws. As for the remaining, well, that's up to you. Mixed linen, keeping kosher, that's up to you. How separate do you want to be in order to gain a closer connection to God? And the Reform movement just doesn't force it on you. Then you have the conservative movement, which ultimately branched off of the Reform movement in the late 1900s because of the Trafa banquet. And what happened was that there was a catering issue. There was a caterer that was the first graduate of the Reform school. At the banquet, the caterer served a bunch of non-kosher items. And I don't know if it was a mix-up or if it was done on purpose, but it is important to note that the president of the Reform College kept kosher himself, was actually married to an Orthodox woman, actually. But the conservative movement basically stated that, okay, Reform is going too far. But at the same time, Orthodox had become so exclusive, so strict, that it became too close-minded. So conservative Judaism originally was meant to be a modern Orthodox at the time. And it actually was. The Orthodox rabbis and the conservative rabbis were interchangeable amongst their schools. The big split between Orthodoxy and conservative happened in the 1950s, 60s, somewhere in there, when the conservative movement stated that women could be rabbis, and it gave authority to conservative Jews that if you needed to drive in order to get to shul, you could, and drive back home. And of course, the Orthodox was not okay with this, so there was a split. And that's basically the whole difference between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. It is the idea of halakha. Halakha, or Jewish law, and the way that they interpret it. The Reform movement says we will follow the ethical laws, but Jewish law itself should adapt to whoever the individual is based on their circumstances. Because not everybody lives close to a shul like the Orthodox community does. So, they place the authority and power in the hands of the individual. The conservative movement says that Jewish law exists and we should follow it, but it has to be able to adapt as times change. Again, once you see modernity, you can't unsee it. And you insult people's intelligence when you try to suppress what they're seeing in the environment around them. So the conservative movement basically gave authority to current rabbis called the Rabbinical Assembly, and they decide and look up things and make halakhic decisions based on the world that we live in today. And then you have the Orthodox movement, which believes that halakha is binding and it can never change. I myself find myself in the conservative camp. And it's nothing against any of the other movements. Because, as I've stated, I don't care what movement you belong to as long as you're ashamed of it. Because I don't believe any particular movement has it 100% right. And it bothers me when people create this hierarchy amongst Jews, because it only helps to divide us. And I like to remind people that anti-Semitism doesn't know a Reform Jew or an Orthodox Jew, they don't care. But I also do this presentation to show that divisions amongst Jews aren't new. And for anyone saying that, well, the Orthodox movement is the same way that Moses did Jewish, and that's not true. Any Jewish scholar will tell you that's not true. Or you have this idea that the Orthodox movement is way up here and everybody else is way down here. That's not true. They just have this idea and this belief system that the more primitive you are, the more religious you are. And I don't believe that. as great as our sages and teachers were, I also believe that they were influenced by the environment that they lived in. For example, the Rambam, one of the most amazing teachers in Jewish history, in my opinion, also lived in an Islamic country. So I take what he said, but I also filter it through the fact that, you lived in an Islamic country. So certain things I don't agree with. And that's okay. I still admire everything that he's done. And we really have to pay attention to that when we're discussing Jewish law. Because, for example, the status of women have changed. And we have to acknowledge that. There are some in the Orthodox that movement that says that women can't be leaders and teachers and rabbis, etc. But how much of that was influenced by the environment around you? You see, in Christianity and Catholicism and Lutheranism, women can't be leaders in churches. In Islam, women can't be imams or leaders. How much of that influenced halakha or Jewish law to say that women can't be witnesses? Because back then, women had very little education. Very few could read, write, etc. But now, women have the same access to education as men do. So you have to be able to adapt. Again, that is what the Pharisees did, and that is what has kept Judaism alive today, in my opinion. It has to be able to adapt. I believe that in Judaism, there was always a pathway for women. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, according to Jewish tradition, had a higher prophecy than Abraham did. Abraham and Sarah got into a debate, and God told Abraham, listen to your wife. Devorah was a judge at her time. She was a prophetess and a judge. But I think when Christianity and Islam took over, that influenced Jewish law to the point where now women were just looked at as reproduction machines. And Jews took after that and followed that module. And because the Orthodox Hashkafa has essentially froze halakha in time, they still uphold that. So, which is why they say that women can't be rabbis. Women can't be witnesses. But I always ask Orthodox Jews, what would have happened if he froze halakha in the United States in the 1950s, 60s, when me as a black man was under the oppression of Jim Crow? Couldn't get certain jobs and whatnot. Would I be allowed to be a rabbi as a black man? And what happens if he froze it? That's the way that I look at the status of women, which is why I believe that Judaism has always been an evolving thing. We have to be able to adapt. That being said, I think that Orthodox Jews are some of the most amazing scholars and teachers that I've had the privilege to learn from. I always say that I'm a brilliant person because I know I'm not. I surround myself with brilliant individuals and I learn from them. So the Orthodox movement is amazing at keeping as many mitzvahs as they can, etc. But in doing so, they've become so close-minded and so exclusive that it appears judgmental to others. And make no mistake about it, in religious communities, ultra-religious communities, they have their own fair share of issues. I came from an Orthodox background. They have their own issues. They just don't want you to know about it. So it's all a perception thing. It's all an image thing. But again, Orthodox Jews, in the Orthodox Union, that's basically how I keep kosher. Because of the Orthodox Union. So I think Orthodox Jews are amazing teachers, scholars, etc. I just feel that they have went overboard in their authority to be able to manipulate conversions and say that you need 3 male Orthodox rabbis. Halakha doesn't say that. When you take things overboard, and even the rabbinate in Israel has decided it has the power to nullify conversions. So you may be Jewish one day, and it's taking it upon itself to say that you're not Jewish another day. I don't think that conversion was ever meant to be that difficult at all. Again, Abraham and Sarah opened their tent on all 4 sides. I think that it was meant to be very welcoming. Even the Talmud recounts that Rabbi Hillel converted someone on false pretenses. And it literally says in Jewish law, tell people that want to convert about the more stringent laws and the less stringent laws and the punishment for breaking those laws. But don't go into much detail, lest you turn them from a good path to a bad one. So the Orthodox, with their idea of turning away people 3 times and making conversion years or even decades long, no, I don't think that that's ever meant. That was ever supposed to be a thing. Then you have the Reform movement, which again holds to the ethical laws and places the rest in your hands. You want to keep kosher, keep kosher. You don't want to mix linen, don't mix linen, etc., etc. But they're very welcoming. And they take it upon themselves to, when they see an injustice, they respond to it. They make it their responsibility. And I think that's beautiful. On the other side, you, in my opinion, see many Reform Jews that don't push education as much as other movements. Many Reform Jews don't know Hebrew. And you start seeing this encouragement of certain behaviors that go against the Torah. Not judging, but it's something that I don't personally align with. And then you have the conservative movement, which Again, I believe that it's the closest way to how Jewish people adapted. They seen change through the lens of Torah and Halakha, and they adapted accordingly. But because the conservative movement is bad with marketing itself, you don't know too many conservative Jews, it's causing people to drift from one extreme or the other. So I think that there should be a stronger push to get the conservative movement back into the media, the picture again. Again, I don't care what movement you are a part of as long as you're ashamed of it. Because we all need each other. Imagine if the Orthodox, with its vast knowledge, scholars, and teachers, came together with the Reform, with its social justice and welcoming. Imagine if they came together. It would be amazing. But for the ones that say that, well, I converted Reform, or in some cases I converted conservative, I will say this: if you took a Judaism 101 course, or you gained knowledge, found a sponsoring rabbi, and they taught you, and if you're a male, you underwent circumcision, or if you already had one, you did a hatafat ambri, whatever the case may be, and you went before 3 learned Jews, and they accepted you into the community. You went in the mikveh, and you came out, you're Jewish. Period. And don't let anyone take your identity from you. Understand that Jewish law is on your side. You are Jewish, just as Jewish as Moses. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not Orthodox anymore, is because I don't believe in the mystical sides of Judaism. I don't believe in this notion of a Jewish soul and things like that. Because what that does is it creates a superiority complex. Because now, imagine you have a convert. They convert to Reform Judaism, and they keep the ethical laws, and they keep kosher. They're trying to gain a close connection with God. And then you have another individual whose mother just so happened to be Jewish, but they don't even believe in God. They're not worried about observing any laws, things like that. And what the mystical aspects of Judaism says is that you should favor that secular Jew over the convert. And I don't believe that. Because what the Orthodox would do is say, well, that convert, because they converted Reform, isn't really Jewish. But the secular, they had a Jewish mother, so I don't believe that a just God operates like that. So I don't believe in the mystical elements or the Jewish soul and whatnot. I think that what you do with the gift of life determines who you are. And Judaism is open to anyone and everyone. And I hate the infighting between us. But as I've demonstrated through this presentation, it's not new. And even before the Reform movement came on the scene, There were the Hasidim and the Misnagdim going at each other. And even before that, it was the Pharisees and the Sadducees going at each other. And even before that, it was the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah going at each other. And before that, when we were in the desert, the people who supported the golden calf and the people that they were going at each other. And before that, you had Jacob's son Joseph and the brothers going at each other. We've never been a monolith, ever. So if you meet someone and you tell them that, or they tell you that you're not really Jewish, if you're a convert, hold that certificate up proud. Hang it in your house somewhere. Hold it up proud, and don't let anyone take it from you. And I am honored to be your Jewish brother. I am honored. Don't let anyone take your identity away. There is so much anti-Semitism in the world that we can't afford to be divided. We can learn from one another. And that's my message in this presentation to anyone that is battling with, I converted Reform, I converted conservative. Will my conversion be accepted? Don't concentrate so much on that. Concentrate on God. If you put your conversion in the hands of other people and you're constantly seeking that validation, I'd argue that you're drifting very close to idol worship, because you're requiring the validity of what you did, and you're questioning what you went through in order to become Jewish. Because understand that I'm sure that it alienated people. I'm sure you may have been family members don't speak to you anymore. Friends don't communicate with you anymore. Been turned down on dates once they find out that you're Jewish. And then on the flip side, to get it from some Jews that, oh, you're not really Jewish. So you get hit on both sides. But I'm telling you that you are Jewish, and I have the utmost respect for specifically Reformed Jews and conservative Jews, because I know how hard it is. See, it's easy for the Orthodox Jew, easier for Orthodox Jews when you live in the Orthodox community and you're walking distance to your shul, and there's a kosher store near you, etc., etc. But what happens when you take that Orthodox Jew out of that community and place them somewhere else that isn't near a kosher restaurant or their shul? What happens then? You have Reformed Jews and conservative Jews trying to shed their light, and don't let anyone try to dim it. I hope through this presentation that you've learned Jews have always been our worst enemies at times, our worst critics. But if you went through that process, you are Jewish. And don't let anyone take it from you. So, if you found this presentation helpful, informative, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Do me an even greater favor and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate all the support that I am given. Thank you all so much. Be good to yourselves. Be good to others. And until the next presentation, You all take care.